Hello and welcome to Dotting the I in Spaceship, a podcast about science fiction and writing. I'm Bob and this is episode 8. This week I want to talk about the trope that aliens are always smarter than us, but before we get into that, some quick housekeeping. Last week I wrote a blog post about doubling down and getting a bunch of work done. On Tuesday I did a free flash fiction story called Big Splash, which is written from the prompt that aliens make stupid first contact. I did a review of Silence of the Lambs, and my Patreon exclusive flash fiction was a story about the first time traveller. Next week there'll be a blog, a free story, a review, a Patreon exclusive, and a podcast, so keep your eyes and ears peeled. So I'm still trying to slog through the backlog that was created by having nearly a week off at one point, after doing 6 days of work in a row and not having enough time to do art things. There's an element, I guess, to like Tantalus's torment when it comes to trying to catch up on the content before I start releasing publicly that I'm writing stuff and putting it up on my Twitter regularly, that there's new content on the website, because every week that I'm behind is another week of content that I have to catch up. So I need, you can't just do the week's work, you've got to do more than the week's work to catch up and get in front. So I'm hoping that by the end of the week, which will be, I've got to go away this weekend, but I have Monday off. So I'm hoping that by Monday I can catch up with everything, be entirely on top of things, and then I'm going to start pushing out notices on social media about new content that I'm doing, and start to try and build a readership. Even without pushing it on social media, I've already seen some people are checking out the website and finding it by just the fact that there's new content being put up, and Google likes it when there's new content being put up, and it's starting to tell people about it. So I think we're doing alright. I've got, 12 free short fictions on the website now, so the volume of content is starting to build up. The quality of the content is starting to trend up a bit as well. Not the story this week, but the story last week called Lottery, something that I'm really happy with, and it's got an ineffable quality almost, where there's something I can't quite put my finger on, of like, am I being too heavy-handed with metaphors, or am I being too subtle? And I feel like the uncomfortable part in the middle there, where you're not 100% sure which way you should go, seems to be exactly where I want to be. And I'm really happy with that story. So outside of work and writing, I've been focusing a little bit this week on getting the rest of my life organized. So trying to organize a good food plan and organize a good exercise regime, because you can't really write if you're sick all the time, or you're dead, or you're not getting enough sleep. And I'll be the first to admit that as a night shift worker, those things do take a beating. When you're feeling pretty terrible all the time, it's pretty easy to eat a bunch of junk food. It's really hard to get good solid sleep on a regular basis. And it's easy to put off things like doing exercise because, well, I'll have more time in the future, maybe one day when I get a better job during the day or whatever. Honestly, you've got to make hay while the sun shines, and so you've still got to be looking after yourself and trying to make positive strides in your life outside of just going to work and coming home. Hopefully, better food, better sleep, and better bodiness will help me make good art, because, that's why I'm doing it. Alright, before I get on to the main topic, I would like to thank those who have supported me on Patreon. Currently my Wall of Awesome has only 3 names on it, and if you want to get your awesomeness level up, you can reach the top of it and be named on the podcast. Currently Zevin Art is sitting at the top of the Wall of Awesome, but there's still time for you to stage a coup and take the position from him. My Patreon supporters have access to 10 Patreon exclusive flash fiction pieces, with a new one being added every week. For as little as $1 a month, you get access to those 10 stories and all of the new ones. If you don't have any spare cash to help out with Patreon, but you still want to help out, there's plenty of ways that don't cost a cent. You can tell a friend who's interested in sci-fi about the podcast, you can rate or comment the podcast, you can just visit my website and check it out. And of course, if all else fails, you can build a giant space laser and use it to burn my website address into the face of the moon. I really appreciate any level of support. So the topic for this week is the common trope that aliens are always smarter than us. There's this idea that aliens must be smarter than us, especially if it's in a circumstance where they've, flown through interstellar space to get to Earth to make contact with us. They have to be smarter than us. I think the source of this trope is actually just arrogance and hubris, in that there has always been this idea that the civilized people are more intelligent than the barbarians. I mean, strangers can't be smarter than us. They believe in the wrong gods. So when examining if it's reasonable that aliens should be smarter than us, I think it's worth pointing out that structurally there is no difference between a human now and a human from 100,000 years ago. If you plucked a person from 100,000 years ago out of time and brought them to the modern day, they would be just as capable of learning as a modern human. Although admittedly, as my Patreon short fiction explored this week, they would probably immediately die within a few days due to, lack of antibodies. So we should probably keep the time-travelling experiments where we pluck people from the past to a minimum where possible. What I'm saying is, we shouldn't fall into the trap of assuming that knowledge is the same as intelligence. I mean, intelligence isn't even something that's really well defined in the modern day and age. Metrics such as IQ tests are notoriously unreliable methods of determining whether or not someone's actually intelligent. They may be able to examine cursorily how people actually think about things, but in a lot of cases it's more a test of knowledge than it is a test of intelligence. And don't even get me started on the difference between IQ and EQ, and the difference between book smarts and street smarts, and the difference between, functional, practical knowledge versus just reading something from a textbook. If aliens rock up tomorrow and they've travelled the vast distances between the stars and they have access to these incredible technologies, then it's probably reasonable to say that they have more knowledge than us. But I don't know that it's reasonable to say that they're technically more intelligent than us. Although, a slight aside, wisdom is a function of analysing knowledge, and so therefore, if an alien race has more knowledge than us, they probably are more wise. Which could lead to them both being either more or less arrogant than us. Personally, I've always been more attracted to sci-fi where the sentient people are assumed to be equal, and intelligence is based on merit rather than this one class of people is better than the other. Although that could be influenced by being Australian, the Australian culture has more of a focus on equality over liberty than is found in some places in the world. Anyway, getting back on topic, one of the sci-fi shows that always handled this really well in my opinion was Star Trek. Star Trek always assumed that aliens and different types of life forms were coming from an equal place. Some of the best episodes of The Next Generation are the episodes that focus around Data and Data's ability to have the right to choose, to have the right to exist in society and what his place is, whether or not he's sentient or property. It's a relatively new idea in human society that all humans are equal, let alone adding in aliens or androids or any of the other things. And I always felt that that was one of the virtues of Star Trek, was to assume that everyone is equal and to treat everyone with some basic dignity and respect, versus creating a kind of class system that we might see in other sci-fi stories. Like, even Star Wars has an aspect of a class sort of thing. Certain aliens were more prone to be criminals in the Star Wars universe. If they were Hutts, they were more likely to be criminals. I think there is one Twi'lek in the prequel movies that's shown to be a Jedi. I forget her name. But every other Twi'lek that we see in all of Star Wars media is a slave. Now, admittedly, it's probably truer to the kind of society that's portrayed in Star Wars, where there's a massive quantity of inequality between the rim worlds and the interior worlds. So the inequality between these races is probably something that would actually occur, and it's definitely something that we can point to a historical precedent for, of races being integrated into a larger society that are in the minority being mistreated or starting at a lower socioeconomic footing. So I think there's definitely a case for having a world where there is inequality shown. That said, there is also an element of future speculation when it comes to science fiction that bears being taken into consideration. I've said it before on the podcast, science fiction falls largely into two kind of structures. One is a hopeful image of the future, and the other one is a dystopian future of, the consequences should we go down this path. And I think Star Trek is definitely a hopeful look at the future, even when it fails to sometimes do that. The original Star Trek definitely was a product of its time. But Star Wars shows the dystopian consequences of the difference between the powerful and the not so powerful. Star Wars is definitely a far grittier universe. We meet Luke, who is an orphan. Before the end of the first act, his surrogate parents are also killed. Both his aunt and uncle and old Ben Kenobi, who he sees as a mentor. So very quickly we're brought into this universe where there are dire consequences for crossing the wrong people, and those consequences typically end up in death and fiery corpses. We're also told in the first movie that power is being consolidated into a far more dictatorial structure as the Senate is being dissolved. I think one of the reasons that Star Wars does have these more gritty elements is because it pulls so strongly on history. We see Star Wars retelling elements of things that have happened in history, chiefly during and before the Second World War. And because of that historical realism that it's drawing from, it creates a far more dystopian world. And that's also why the idea of hope, which is the ongoing theme of Star Wars, hits home so well throughout the overarching story, is that the world is rubbish and it's still possible that the power of a single person could change the future. Star Trek, in contrast, is already living in that future. Everybody's equal, people's rights are considered, people don't want for food and hardship, there are no slaves in the Federation, and there hasn't been true poverty in the Federation since the 22nd century. Both Star Wars and Star Trek have this idea that there is no difference in the intelligence of the aliens. While there is a different class structure, that class structure isn't built on an assumption that the Hutts are stupider than the humans. It's built on an assumption that money and economics was more to play than anything else. And that, I don't know that it would be possible to have a Hutt Jedi, but I'm sure it has happened somewhere in someone's fanfiction. But it's stories like Contact and stories like Interstellar, which assume that aliens are not only incredibly far more intelligent than humans, but also have an ineffable quality where the only way to understand an alien is through the prism of some weird spectre or shiny picture on the screen, rather than them actually just talking to us. Arrival also fits into this category, where the aliens are so incredibly different to us and also have the ability to, time travel with words. I don't know what the hell that was about. And I don't have any problem with the idea that the culture of an alien or the way that they both see the world around them and communicate with us could be very difficult. It's an interesting storyline to explore, which is why movies like Arrival initially grabbed my interest. But when you actually watch the movie, you're like, oh no, this isn't good. Because while the hook of the story is we need to communicate with these races, and we've brought in this incredible bio-exo-linguist person who's going to be able to do it, and then she immediately clearly was not researched at all by the writer of how the hell a linguist would try and work out how to communicate with someone using a different language. And then the middle build and the climax veers off into an entirely different question, which is, equally distressing. We go from how we're going to talk to these aliens to, okay, the method in which these aliens communicate grants us the ability to see into different aspects of time, and then maybe should we possibly have children if we know that they might be hurt in the future using this magic alien technology that the aliens have only given us because in 800 years or something they're gonna need our help? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, if the aliens don't have any choice in the matter and are forced to essentially come to Earth and give us this incredible time-mongling technology, which then not only predicts the future but locks it into place, then the question is, was there any choice at all? And what I'm really saying is this movie doesn't explore any of those ideas very well. But hey, if you like the movie, that's great. Getting back on topic, if we want to explore whether or not aliens are smarter than us or not, the way to explore it isn't by looking at aliens who have shown a clear technological superiority, but to think about what would happen if we discovered a race of aliens who were inferior to us in technological skill. In history, we have always viewed cultures from other places as being inferior to our own because of hubris and a superiority complex which is hardwired into our genes. So if, say, tomorrow we happen to point one of the new magic satellites that's searching for life at one of the nearby exoplanets and found a culture there, would we see them as equal to us or inferior to us? I'm talking about, you look through a telescope and you see a race of people who are different to us. I think thinking about it through this prism, asking ourselves what we would do in that situation is the way to think about whether or not we should assume that aliens are smarter than us, or if they're, dumber than us, or if they should be considered to be equal. So in this hypothetical, we're definitely talking about a civilization of people that don't have space travel. The question then becomes, what do we do about it? Do we try and send a probe to talk to them? Should we make first contact or not? And if we do make first contact, what information do we give about ourselves? Do we give them information about how to make energy sources and construction techniques that might be very beneficial to keeping the rain off of their backs? Or do we say, no, we should leave their culture alone and apply an element of planetary protection? So NASA has a Department of Planetary Protection, or an office, or it's just a dude who says, no, don't do that, a lot. And basically they have a policy where they don't want to accidentally contaminate places where there may or may not be life. And so I think that doesn't apply if we know there is life there. I think if we know there's life there, then we're not worried so much about planetary protection in that, every time we send a spacecraft to Mars, we have to make sure that it's sterile, and we made sure that we flew, I think, Cassini into Saturn because we didn't want it to accidentally hit one of the moons where life might exist in the very, very far away future if their orbits eventually lined up. So, if we knew that there was life on Mars, however, we would still have a policy of not sending them random germs to murder everyone. So I think, there's definitely some questions around what is or isn't good conduct when it comes to sending space probes to make first contact with aliens. But assuming that we could send a space probe to them, which, at the moment we couldn't, but assuming that we could, should we? Should we give them information about farming techniques that might increase the amount of food and decrease the amount of suffering that their people, if they're subsistence farmers, then they're highly influenced by drought, flooding and famine, and should we try to decrease their potential pain by giving them the information that they need to be able to grow crops and store crops, or should we withhold that information and say they're a different culture, shouldn't do that, we should let them be on their own? And then when you think about that, idea of non-interference with another culture, the prime directive kind of idea, it does definitely have a sterile and stark nature to it. I mean, we as humans often dictate to nature what is or isn't allowed to happen. We try to save endangered species, and we don't have the same idea of non-interference of like, well, the pandas can just get offed. Then again, we don't save endangered species equally. Do we only save the fluffy-looking aliens? Maybe not. But if we did happen to come across an alien civilization that was less advanced than our own, and we could see danger coming, would we really stand back and allow them to be wiped off of the face of the universe just because of the high ideal that, well, they should be allowed to be themselves and us interfering with them would change them fundamentally? I don't really know the answer to that. It's just a fun thing to think about. But even if it was the case that we discovered a race of people that were about to be destroyed, we could see that they were going to be destroyed, and we had the ability to give them the technology to save themselves, are they stupider than us for not having discovered it? Or, does it turn out, they don't look like they're more technologically advanced than us, but actually that's because they're hyper-technologically advanced and they live in harmony because they've got mechanisms too. I think it's a mistake to assume that any culture is less advanced or developed than any other culture. I mean, especially considering that Australia has the oldest continuous culture on the planet, still kicking around, although it's taken a few hits in the last couple of 100 years with the introduction of Europeans, but even so, it's definitely a mistake to say that the Australian Aboriginals were less intelligent than the Europeans, because the Europeans had tall ships and the Aboriginals knew where the water was. They know where the food is. In the early days of the Sydney colony, there was mass amounts of famine in the European colony because they didn't know how to use the land around them to their benefit. So who was the idiots? We know that there are no cultures of humans on the planet that are less intelligent than any other. Just people with different access to different information, which is largely about luck and circumstance. And we see that over and over again in history. If the Athenians hadn't come across the silver deposit that allowed them to build the necessary navy that they needed to defeat the Persians, is it very possible that the Persians would have completely annihilated Greece, and the face of Western democracy would be completely different. Without the Greeks to hold off the Persians, the Romans would have been overrun by the Persian Empire and never would have grown into the Roman Empire, which wouldn't have created a kind of monoculture around the Mediterranean, which wouldn't have led to the creation and prosperity that came from the development of things like Roman roads and aqueducts, and then wouldn't have led to new farming techniques, and it wouldn't have led to the creation of the states of Europe, which wouldn't have led to the creation of, the printing press and the computer. On the other hand, there's no way of knowing whether or not Persian control of the Mediterranean wouldn't have led to exactly the same kind of technological developments. And certainly there is the idea that some technological developments, it's just their time when they happen. There was something like 100 different patents for the typewriter when it was being developed, because it's just one of those ideas where its time had definitely come. It's much like the argument between whether or not, Newton or Leibniz discovered calculus. It seems unlikely, considering they were working in different parts of the world and they weren't communicating with each other, but it also seems suspicious that someone created and developed a concept as complex as calculus separately at almost exactly the same time. On the other hand, time had just come. Either way, I think we definitely can say that no matter whether or not Persia had taken over the Greeks, they probably all would have been murdered by Genghis Khan. Because as we all know, in all forms of all histories, the Mongol Empire is not something that can be avoided merely by changing everything about history. I think the other thing to think about is what would happen if we were the people who were contacted, right? If a probe was discovered to have been sent from a faraway place that is trying to talk to us and teach us, how would we react to it? Would we assume that the aliens who had sent it were just as curious as us? Or would we assume, malevolent or benevolent attributes to the aliens based on their actions? I certainly feel that humankind would not trust the motives of someone giving them something for free. And it's even more interesting to think about if you develop a scenario in your head where the aliens sending the probe is from very far away, a significant number of light years. Let's say it's from the probe was sent 7,000 years ago because they detected a pre-industrial civilization on Earth, and they at that time had the ability to send a probe all the way to Earth. I mean, would it change how we see ourselves in the universe? I think definitely. But would it motivate us to try and build a probe and send it back? We would be like, well, it's already 7,000 years ago, and we haven't received a second one, so maybe they never got any more developed. Or maybe they're still waiting for a reply. Depending on the contents of the probe and how much information they're giving away to us for free, we certainly might see them as rubes. Anyway, I think I've definitely beaten this topic to death. Next week, my story on Tuesday will be written from the prompt marriage license, which I'm pretty sure when I wrote down the prompt I had a plan for, but I don't remember what it was, so I'm going to have to work that out. I'm planning on doing a review of the TV show Carnival Row. I watched that last week and I haven't quite worked out what I think about it. So it'd be good to get my thoughts down on the page and get them solidified. Next Thursday, my prompt for that story is An Alien Experiences 2019. Sort of similar to the idea that I had about the New York Yankee in reverse, where I wanted him to experience the future from the eyes of someone in the past, but turns out as soon as I transferred him to the future, he immediately died. So that was unfortunate for him. The topic for the podcast next week is that humans are always the good guys and aliens are always the bad guys, and I want to explore that trope, hopefully a little less rambly than I explored the trope this week. Remember that if you want to send me any suggestions for story prompts, I'm more than welcome to hear from you, and you can tell me your thoughts about whether or not you think that aliens should be considered to be equal to us, smarter than us, or stupider than us, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. If you want to contact me, you can contact me at contact@robert-lynch.com or on Twitter at BobLynchBSC. If you like what I do and you want me to make more of it, you can think about helping me out by supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/RobertLynch. As always, check out my website for new stuff every weekday, and I will see you next week.